Have you ever had a secret you were terrified to say out loud? Even to yourself? Well, I do, and it took me years before I could finally speak it without my voice shaking. My name is Claire. I am 36 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized neighborhood in Los Angeles, in a house with a small garden that my mother tended every spring with a kind of devotion she never quite managed to direct at me. I had a bedroom with yellow walls and a bookshelf I filled twice over, and a childhood that looked, from the outside, like something decent and normal and fine. That was the word we used a lot in my family. Fine. Everything was always fine. And for a very long time, I believed that because believing it was easier than looking at what was underneath it. Before I go any further, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Seriously, drop your city, your state, your country, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. I love knowing who is on the other side of this. Now, let me tell you what happened at Easter dinner 2 years ago, and why a single envelope on a table full of people changed the entire story of my life. I was the middle child. My older sister Diane was 3 years ahead of me, and my younger brother Todd was 4 years behind. And if you know anything about middle child dynamics in a family that already has its favorites sorted out by the time you're old enough to notice, you'll understand when I say that I spent most of my childhood doing everything right and still feeling somehow adjacent to the family rather than inside it. Not neglected in the dramatic sense. Fed, clothed, enrolled in school, taken to the doctor. All the basics were covered, but there was this particular quality of attention that Diane got that I never did, the kind where your parent tracks you, where they remember the thing you mentioned last week and ask about it, where they laugh at your jokes because they find you genuinely funny, and not just because it's the polite thing to do. Diane had that. Todd, as the youngest and the only boy, had his own version of it. And I had a bookshelf and a bedroom and the quiet understanding, absorbed so early I couldn't have told you when it started, that I was somehow a slightly lesser fit in this particular family unit. I used to tell myself I was being too sensitive. That is the thing families like mine are very good at teaching you. The vocabulary of your own dismissal, all the phrases and frameworks that turn your real perception into a personal flaw. You're too sensitive, Claire. You read too much into things. You always make everything into a bigger deal. I heard those sentences so many times growing up that by the time I was in my 20s, they had become my own internal voice, the automatic response that fired every time I noticed something that felt wrong. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe the problem is me. My dad, Robert, was a quiet man with a strong handshake and opinions he delivered like verdicts. He worked in insurance for 30 years and approached most situations in life with the same energy he brought to risk assessment, which is to say he was skeptical, measured, and deeply resistant to anything that complicated his existing model of how things were supposed to work. He was not a cruel man. I want to be careful about that. He was not the kind of father who raged or drank or said things designed to wound. He was the kind of father who was simply more interested in some of his children than others, and who had apparently decided somewhere along the way that this was acceptable, or maybe he had never examined it at all, which is its own kind of problem. My mom, Patricia, was warmer and more complicated. She was the one who remembered birthdays and made the food and held the family social calendar in her head like a second job. She was capable of real tenderness. I had experienced it from her, genuinely, in enough moments that her other behavior was all the more confusing for the contrast. She could be loving and attentive in one breath, and in the next she would say something that landed so far off center that I would spend 3 days trying to figure out what she had meant by it. She had a talent for the sentence that sounds like a compliment until you turn it over. "Oh, Claire, you've always been so independent," said with a kind of tone that made independent sound like code for something else, something they had long ago decided about me that they never fully shared to my face. I moved out at 22, right after college, and went to Columbus for a job at a mid-sized marketing firm where I was reasonably good at what I did and reasonably happy in the small, sustainable way of someone who has organized a life around what is achievable rather than what they dream about. I had an apartment I liked. I had a few close friends, the kind of friendships that are built slowly and hold weight. I had a routine and a savings account and a cat named Bernard who was enormous and opinionated and the most consistent presence in my life for several years. I drove home to my parents' house on holidays because that is what you do, and every time I did I felt the same low-grade tension in my chest that I had felt as a kid, that particular alertness of a person navigating a space where the rules are not written down, but the penalties for breaking them are real. Diane, in her 30s, had settled into the role of favorite with the complete comfort of someone who has never had to question their position. She lived 15 minutes from my parents, had married a man named Greg, who my dad loved because they shared the same politics and the same affection for golf, and she had 2 kids who my parents doted on in the full, wholehearted presence of body and spirit way. They had never quite managed with me. I was not bitter about the grandchildren thing. I genuinely wasn't. I liked my niece and nephew, but I always noticed. I had been noticing my whole life, and I was very tired of noticing. Todd was the good time kid of the family, the one who could walk into a room and shift the energy, who made my dad laugh in a way that was relaxed and unguarded, who my mom called her baby even though he was a 6'1", 32-year-old man who worked in real estate and had 3 different women he was casually seeing and could not be bothered to do his own laundry. Todd was not malicious. He was just the golden child in the way that certain youngest sons in certain families simply are without effort or intention, simply by virtue of being who they are to the people who made them. The Easter before the one that changed everything, I had a conversation with my mom on the phone that I have replayed so many times since. I had mentioned something small, something about a promotion I was hoping for at work, and she had said, in that way of hers, "Oh, Claire, you've always had to work so hard for things, haven't you?" Not a question, an observation delivered with a kind of sympathy that had the shape of comfort and the weight of something else entirely. I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Oh, nothing, just that Diane never had to try as hard. Things came more naturally to her." And then she moved on to talking about the Easter menu, as if she had said nothing remarkable at all. I thought about that sentence for weeks. Diane never had to try as hard. There was something in it that I could not locate, but could not leave alone, either like a splinter you can feel, but not quite reach. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself my mother had simply made a clumsy observation, and I was turning it into a referendum on my entire childhood, because that is what therapy had made me prone to doing. I had been in therapy for 2 years at that point, working through things I could not yet fully name, and my therapist, a calm and unhurried woman named Dr. Sasha Lim, had been gently and persistently pointing at the patterns I kept describing without fully seeing. The Easter that changed my life happened on a Sunday in April 2 years ago. I drove the 90 minutes from Columbus to my parents' house in the same car I'd had for 6 years, with Bernard in his carrier in the back seat because I could never find anyone to watch him, and my mom had long ago stopped complaining about the cat because I had long ago stopped asking for permission to bring him. I arrived at 11:30 in the morning, and the house smelled the way it always smelled on Easter, ham and something sweet baking, and the particular cleaning product smell of a house that has been thoroughly gone over for company. My mom hugged me at the door and told me I looked tired. My dad shook my hand and asked about the drive. Diane was already there with Greg and the kids, settled in the living room with the ease of people who spend a lot of time in a place and know exactly where everything is and where they fit inside it. The other guests arrived by noon. My mom had always kept Easter as a family plus close friends kind of day, and this year that meant Diane and Greg and the kids, Todd, and whatever her name was that month, my dad's brother Uncle Jim, and his wife Carol, my mom's college friend Sandy, who had been coming to holidays for as long as I could remember, Sandy's adult daughter Becca, who I had grown up seeing at these things, and my parents' neighbor Frank, who was 72 and had been eating Easter dinner with them since his wife passed 8 years ago. 13 people around a table that seated 14. The extra leaf put in the way it always was, the good china out, the centerpiece my mom spent 2 weeks deciding on every year without fail. I sat between Becca and Todd. That was my spot, the middle of the table, a little away from both ends where my parents anchored everything. We ate and passed dishes and had the overlapping conversations of a holiday table. And I felt the familiar low hum of being present, but not quite centered, participating, but not quite belonging, which I had stopped expecting to feel differently about. I was managing it well. I was doing what I always did, staying pleasant and engaged and quietly full of the low-grade ache that I no longer had a name for, because I had been living with it so long it felt like just the shape of my body at family events. It was after the main course, when the ham had been mostly eaten and the side dishes were going around for seconds and the conversation had settled into that comfortable holiday lull, that my dad cleared his throat in the way he did when he was about to say something he had decided needed saying. I noticed it. I noticed the way my mom looked at her plate when he did it, which I would only fully understand later. I noticed the way Diane glanced at Greg and Greg looked at his hands. I noticed these things in the way I always notice things in real time and filed them under probably nothing while continuing to pass the rolls to Frank on my left. My dad said, "I want to say something while everyone's here." His voice had the quality it got when he was entering verdict mode, measured and definitive, the tone of a man who has made a decision and considers the decision final. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think it's time the family knew the full picture. The table got quiet in the gradual way of a group of people picking up on a tone shift and adjusting accordingly. Becca stopped mid-sentence next to me. Sandy put down her fork. The kids were in the other room watching something, which I was later grateful for. My dad looked at me. He said, "Claire is not our biological daughter." I want to tell you what happened in the 10 seconds after those words were said. I want to describe it accurately because it matters. The room did not erupt. There was no immediate chaos or gasping or dramatic response. What happened was much worse than that. What happened was a silence so complete and so loaded that I could hear the kids' show playing in the other room and the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen and my own heartbeat doing something strange and too fast in my chest. What happened was that I sat at my parents' Easter table in a house I had grown up in and watched every person in that room process something they apparently had not known, and I sat there processing the fact that whatever it was they were learning, I apparently had not known it either. He kept talking. He said that they had adopted me at birth, a private adoption, that my biological mother was a young woman who had been unable to keep me, that they had intended to tell me when I was older, but the time never seemed right, and eventually it had just become the thing they didn't talk about. He said it the way he said most things, without visible emotion, as if he were reading the terms and conditions of something, covering the points in order. My mom was still looking at her plate. Diane was looking at me with an expression I could not read. Todd looked like he had been told something he already knew and was trying to decide how to position his face about it. And then my dad said the thing that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, not because of what it revealed about me, but because of what it revealed about him. He said, "I just think families should be honest with each other. No more secrets." He said this at Easter dinner, in front of his brother and his wife's friend and their neighbor Frank. He said it as if this was an act of transparency, of integrity, as if delivering the information that his 34-year-old daughter was not biologically his in front of 13 people at a holiday table was something a person does out of a commitment to honesty. I sat very still. Uncle Jim said, "Robert," just his name, the same way Pastor Williams had said it in a story I once heard, low and carrying a full sentence inside a single word. Sandy looked at my mom and said, "Patricia, did she not know?" My mom said, very quietly, "We were going to tell her." Sandy said, "She's 34 years old." I pushed my chair back. I did not do it dramatically. I pushed it back the way you push a chair back when you are finished eating and need to stand up slowly and with control. And I stood up and I picked up my napkin from my lap and I folded it and I set it on the table next to my plate. I looked at my father. I said, in a voice that I am still proud of because it did not shake, "I need a few minutes." And I walked out the back door into the yard. It was April, and it was cold out. That particular Midwestern April cold that never fully believes in spring yet. And I stood on the back porch in my dress and my flats, and I held my own arms, and I looked at my mother's garden, the one she tended every year with that devoted attention. The tulips just coming up in the beds along the fence, red and yellow, and a deep purplish pink that she had always loved. And I thought the most absurd thing. I thought, I wonder if she would have planted this garden differently if she had known I would be standing here looking at it right now. And I almost laughed. I almost laughed at myself for thinking it. And the almost laugh is the thing that actually cracked me open, because it meant I was still me, still the person who had a dark sense of humor about the worst moments, still standing in her own body, even though the ground underneath it had just shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. I stood out there for maybe 7 minutes. Becca came to the door and asked if I was okay. And I said, "I just need a minute." And she said, "Okay," and left me alone, which was the right thing to do, and I have never forgotten it. When I went back inside, I collected my bag from the front hall. I got Bernard's carrier from the room my mom had set him up in, and I said goodbye. I said it to the room. I did not make individual eye contact with anyone except Uncle Jim, who stood up and held my arm for a moment and said, "I'm sorry, Claire. This wasn't right." I said, "I know." I said, "Thank you." I got in my car. I drove 40 minutes before I pulled over at a rest stop on the highway and sat with my hands on the steering wheel and let it come. I let all of it come. The whole 34-year inventory of every moment that made slightly more sense now, every time I had felt adjacent to the family, every sentence my mother had delivered that had an edge she never fully explained, every time my father had looked at me with that quality of assessment rather than affection, every time Diane's ease in that house had contrasted so completely with my own uncertainty in it. I sat in a rest stop on I-70 in Ohio on an April Sunday with a cat in the back seat meowing with concern, and I let myself feel the full enormity of what I had just been handed, not gently, not privately, but at a table full of people who would now carry this information in ways I could not control. I cried for a long time, not the polished cinematic kind, the ugly, physical kind that starts in your stomach and takes everything with it on the way out. I let it happen because it needed to, and because no one was watching, and because I had spent 34 years being told I was too sensitive. And in this rest stop on this highway, I was done performing composure for an audience that had just proven they did not deserve the performance. Then I drove home. I fed Bernard. I called Dr. Lim and left a message. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table until almost midnight going over everything slowly and carefully, the way you go over something when you are trying to find the edges of it, when you are trying to understand what exactly you are holding. I did not call my parents that night. I did not call Diane. I did not respond to the 3 texts my mom sent, each one a variation of the same attempt at explanation. The last one ending with "please call me when you're ready." I put my phone face down and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours and then fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life, not because of the adoption itself. I want to be clear about that. The fact of being adopted was something I processed separately and with more complexity and eventually more peace than I expected. What was hard, the thing that sat on my chest like weight I could not shift, was the method. The 34 years of knowing and not telling. The Easter dinner. The 13 people. The folded napkin on the table. And my mother's face looking at her plate, while my father announced the thing they had kept from me my entire life as if it were a budget update at a board meeting. I called Dr. Lim the next morning when the office opened, and she got me in that Thursday, and we sat in her calm, plant-filled office, and I told her everything, and she listened in that unhurried way of hers. And then she said, "Tell me what you're feeling right now, under the hurt. What's the truest thing?" I thought about it for a long moment, and then I said, "Relief." She waited. I said, "I have spent my entire life feeling like I didn't quite fit in that family, and for 34 years, I thought the problem was me. And now, I know the problem was never me. I was never not fitting in. I was simply not being told the truth. And there's something almost like relief in that." Dr. Lim said, "That's an important thing to know about yourself." I said, "It's a terrible way to find it out." She said, "Yes, it is. Both of those things are true." I took 3 weeks before I responded to any family communication. I needed the time to get clear, not to plan anything, not to strategize, but just to understand where I stood before I let anyone else's version of events into the space I was organizing. My mom called twice more. Diane texted once, carefully, saying she had always known, and that she was sorry she had kept it, that their parents had asked her to, that she had not felt like it was her thing to override. I appreciated the honesty of that text more than she probably knew, and I also felt the specific sting of knowing my sister had carried this her whole life and had chosen my parents' request over my right to know. I did not respond immediately. I sat with all of it. I was learning, slowly, that sitting with things before responding to them was one of the most powerful skills I had been working on for years without realizing what it was building toward. About a month after Easter, I hired a private records researcher. I had been thinking about my biological mother. I did not have a fantasy about it. I was not imagining some dramatic reunion or a rescue from the family. I was simply a woman who now knew that half of her story had been withheld and who wanted to at least know the outline of what she had come from. It took 6 weeks. The researcher found her. Her name was Linda. She lived in Michigan. She was 56 years old. She had married at 27, had 2 kids, worked as a school librarian. She had put me up for adoption at 22 because she had been alone and broke and terrified, and she had believed at the time that it was the most loving thing she could do. I wrote her a letter, a real one on paper, which felt right for reasons I couldn't fully explain. I told her who I was. I told her I was not looking for anything specific, that I had no expectations and no agenda, that I simply wanted to know where I had come from and to say that I understood, as much as I could, that she had made a decision under circumstances that deserved more compassion than judgment. I mailed it. Then I waited. She called me 3 weeks later, and the first thing she said was, "I have been hoping for this phone call for 34 years. And we talked for 2 hours on a Tuesday evening, and it was not dramatic, and it was not a fairy tale, and it did not fix anything that was broken, but it was real, and it was honest, and it was more than I had expected, which was already more than I had had before." I want to tell you about the year that followed, because this is where most people's stories skip ahead to the ending, and I do not want to do that to you, because the year in between is the part that actually matters. I kept going to work. I kept seeing Dr. Lim every 2 weeks. I let myself sit with the grief of the childhood narrative that had collapsed and rebuilt itself into something harder and more honest. I cried about it in the specific ways that were coming up, not just the Easter dinner, but the 34 years before it. The 1,000 small moments that made different sense now, the distance I had always felt and always blamed myself for. I grieved those. I was patient with the grieving because Dr. Lim had told me that grief does not have a schedule, and that trying to rush it was like trying to rush a bone healing. You could push too hard and end up further behind than when you started. I also started doing something I had never let myself do before, which was to stop making myself smaller in the spaces that were mine. At work, I had always held back just slightly, always softened my opinions just enough, always let someone else take the credit for a collaborative thing, because I had been raised with the understanding that wanting recognition was unseemly, that ambition needed to apologize for itself. I stopped apologizing. Quietly, gradually, without announcement, I started saying the full version of what I thought in meetings. I started sending the email I would have usually spent an hour softening. I stopped volunteering for the work that no one wanted, and that made me feel useful but invisible. I started asking for the things I wanted clearly and directly, and watching with something like surprise as people responded to that directness, as if it was simply normal, as if I had always been allowed to do this, and no one had told me otherwise. I got promoted 8 months after Easter. Senior strategist. Not the biggest title in the world, but a real step with a real raise, and the kind of responsibility I had been doing unofficially for 2 years and finally had the formal recognition for. My manager, who was a sharp and fair woman named Rita, said during the review, "Claire, I want to know what shifted for you this year, because whatever it is, the team has felt it. You're operating at a completely different level." I said I had done a lot of personal work. She said, "Well, keep going. It's working." I bought a better apartment. I had been in a fine apartment for 4 years, fine being the word, and I found a place with high ceilings and good light and a second bedroom I turned into a real office, and I moved in on a Saturday in February with Mara and a friend named Jay helping and Bernard supervising from a safe distance. I hung things on the walls that I loved without asking anyone's opinion. I cooked food I wanted to eat and listened to music too loud on Sunday mornings and built a life that was, without any particular drama, entirely mine. I want to tell you about the envelope. I know that is what you came for, and I have been building to it, and I am not going to rush it because the context is the point. You have to understand what the year before it was for me to understand why the envelope meant what it meant. The Easter after the Easter that blew up my life, my mother called in February to ask if I was coming to the holiday dinner. I had reestablished a relationship with my parents by this point, careful and boundaried, and different from what it had been before. The way a repaired thing is different from an original, still functional, but with the evidence of what happened written into the structure of it. I had told my mother, in a conversation that took 3 hours and left us both exhausted and more honest with each other than we had ever been, that I would maintain a relationship with them, but that the terms of it had changed, that I would not be performing closeness I did not feel, that if something was wrong, I would say it. that I expected honesty in return. She had cried and said she was sorry, and it was a real apology, the kind that names the thing it is apologizing for without immediately pivoting to a defense. I had not forgiven her completely, and I had not told her I had, but I had let the door stay open because she had earned that much, and because I had decided that withholding it would cost me more than it would cost her. My father was harder. He had never directly acknowledged what he had done, the method, the audience, the decision to make my private information a dinner table announcement. He had said once to my mother, who had relayed it to me, that he had thought being open with the family was the right thing. He had never said it to me. I had been waiting without real expectation for him to get there. I told my mom I would come to Easter. She sounded genuinely relieved. She said it would just be immediate family this year. No Sandy, no Becca, just the core group. I said okay. I drove out on Easter Sunday with Bernard in the back and a casserole dish in the passenger seat and the manila envelope in my bag. I had put the envelope together over the course of about a month. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a legal document or a power play or a prepared speech in paper form. It was 3 things. The first was a copy of my adoption paperwork, the original documents that I had obtained through the records process, my real birth certificate alongside the amended one, the private adoption agreement dated with names and signatures. The second was a letter from Linda, my biological mother, addressed to my parents, that she had written voluntarily and without prompting when I told her the story of how I had found out. It was 2 pages, handwritten, and it said things that I will not detail here because some of them belong to her and not to this story, but the central thing it said was that she had been told by the adoption agency that the family receiving me had agreed to tell me the truth by the time I was 10, and that she had trusted that agreement, and that learning I had been 34 years old and sitting at a holiday dinner when I found out had broken her heart in ways she was still sitting with. The third thing in the envelope was a single printed page, a list of 14 names, the 13 people who had been present at last Easter's dinner plus mine. And next to each name, a single word I had written by hand, witness. I set the envelope on the table in front of my father before we sat down. Not secretly, not with ceremony. I set it there the way you set a document in front of someone who needs to read it, matter-of-factly. And I said, before we eat, I need you to look at what's in here. He looked at the envelope, and then at me, and I watched him calculate something. He opened it. The table was quiet. My mom was standing in the kitchen doorway. Diane was at the counter with a glass of wine. She had stopped lifting to her mouth. Todd was sitting in the chair at the end of the table looking at his phone. And then he wasn't because something in the quality of the silence reached him, and he looked up. My father read the birth certificate first, then the adoption agreement. Then he unfolded Linda's letter, and I watched him read it, and I watched his face do something I had not seen it do before, move through several different things without settling, without finding the usual controlled expression he defaulted to. He got to the list at the end. He held the paper with the 14 names and the word witness repeated 14 times, and he was quiet for a long time. I said, I am not here to fight. I am not here to embarrass you or hurt you. I am here because this is my family, and I have decided to keep showing up for it, even though the cost of doing that has been very high. My voice was level. I had practiced being level not because I was suppressing anything, but because level was the true expression of where I had arrived after a year of work. I was not angry in the hot, reactive way. I was clear. Clear is different from angry. Clear is what you get to when you have done the work that anger alone could never do. What you did last Easter, I said, was not honesty. Honesty would have been telling me the truth when I was old enough to receive it. What you did last year was something else, and I think somewhere in you know what it was. My father put the papers down on the table. He did not look at me for a moment. When he did, I saw something in his face that I had never seen there before in 36 years of looking at it. Not shame exactly, because I do not think my father was built for the full experience of shame, but something adjacent to it, some acknowledgement of a thing he had been not acknowledging for a long time. He said, "I handled it wrong." Those 4 words. I want to tell you what they meant, and also what they did not mean, because both are important. They were not enough. They were not the full accounting I would have written if I were scripting his part of this conversation. They were not the apology that reached the depth of what had happened. But they were real. They were his actual words, not managed or deflected, not wrapped in explanation, just the admission sitting there on the table next to the envelope. And I had learned, in the year between those 2 Easters, that real is the thing you take when you can get it, and that you do not refuse a real thing because it is not as large as the thing you needed. I said, "Yes, you did," and I left it there. I let it be exactly that big and no bigger, because I was not there to prosecute, and I was not there to perform pain, and I was not there to make him feel worse than the truth already made him feel. I was there to be seen, to be honest, to sit at my parents' table as the full and true version of myself, and not the managed, smaller version I had been performing for 30 years. My mom cried. She held my hand across the table, and she said things that were real, and some of them I received, and some of them I held carefully at a distance, and all of it was more honest than it had ever been. Diane said she was sorry for keeping the secret, and I told her I understood the position she had been put in, and that I did not blame her, which was true, and I watched the relief move across her face at hearing it, because Diane had been carrying her own version of this weight, and it was not nothing. Todd, who I had always seen as the kid who got everything easy, said something that surprised me. He said, "I always knew something was off, and I never pushed on it, and that was wrong." I should have asked questions a long time ago. I looked at him. I said, "Yeah, you should have." Not harshly, just honestly. He nodded and took it. We ate Easter dinner. I know that sounds strange after everything I just described, but that is what happened. We sat down, and the food was passed, and we ate, not easily, not the way a family eats when everything is fine, but the way a group of people eat when something real has just happened between them, and they are sitting with it, and the meal is the structure that holds them in the same room long enough for the sitting to happen. It was quiet in stretches, and then not quiet, and it was strange, and it was honest, and it was the most real Easter I had ever spent in that house. Frank was not there this year. Sandy was not there. It was just us, just the people the envelope had been written for. And by the end of the meal, something had shifted in the room that I want to be careful about describing, because I do not want to make it sound bigger than it was. Nothing was fixed. No debt was cleared. No wound was sealed. But the thing that had been under the surface for my entire life was finally above it, finally in the room, finally something we were all looking at directly instead of from the side. And that mattered. It mattered in the specific and unglamorous way that truth matters, not because it felt good, but because it was real, and real is the only ground anything lasting can be built on. I talk to Linda every few weeks. We are building something slow and careful and without expectation, 2 people connected by the most fundamental biological fact, and separated by 34 years, and finding, in the space between those 2 things, something that does not yet have a name, but that feels, when I am in it, like a door that was always there, and that I only recently found the handle to. My relationship with my parents is ongoing and imperfect and true. My father has not become a different person. He is still the man. He is measured and resistant to emotional complexity, still more comfortable with transactions than with tenderness. But he is honest with me now in a way he was not before. And I believe it is because the envelope on the table gave him no remaining option except honesty. And once he was in it, he found that the room was smaller and less frightening than he had built it up to be over 34 years of avoidance. He asked me once in the fall when we were sitting on the porch after dinner while my mom cleaned up, he asked me if I wanted to know more about the circumstances of the adoption, whether I wanted him to explain the decisions they had made. I said yes, and he told me things that were not flattering and were clearly uncomfortable for him to say, and he said them anyway, and I listened without interrupting, and when he finished I said, "Thank you for telling me. That is where we are. It is not a Hallmark card. It is real. I am 36 years old. I have a job I am good at, and a life I built, and a cat who has opinions about everything, and a biological mother who sends me photos of her garden because she remembered that I mentioned my mom's tulips. I have Dr. Lim and the friends who showed up, and the apartment with the high ceilings, and the room that is entirely mine. I have the version of myself that came out of the year between two Easters, the version that stopped apologizing for perceiving things clearly and stopped accepting the explanation that my perception was the problem. And I have the memory of sitting at that table and setting down an envelope and speaking in a level voice to a man who had the power to shape my understanding of myself for 34 years, and watching the power in that room quietly, completely, without drama or volume or any of the emotional pyrotechnics that people use when they're still afraid of being dismissed, shift. I was not afraid of being dismissed. I had stopped being afraid of that somewhere in the year between those two Sundays. And when you stop being afraid of the thing someone has been using to manage you, the thing stops working. It is that simple, and it took me that long. The envelope did not change my family. It changed what my family had to reckon with. That is different. You cannot change people. You can only decide what you are willing to carry for them and what you are going to set down. I set down a lot of weight that Easter. I left it on the table in a manila envelope next to the ham and the good china, and I drove home 90 minutes on a Sunday evening with Bernard in the back seat and the windows cracked for the spring air, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could remember, like I was not in the middle of someone else's story about who I was. I was in mine. That is the whole thing. That is the only thing. I was finally, fully in mine. If any part of this story landed with you, if you saw yourself in any piece of it, please leave me a comment. Tell me what it brought up. Tell me if you have sat at a table like that one, or if you have been carrying something for a long time that belongs to someone else. I read everything, and if you are not subscribed yet, please do it now. There are more stories coming, and they are all built on the same foundation as this one. Truth told the long way, the honest way, the way that actually holds. I will see you in the next one.